Bonjour à tous, donc je suis à Baltimore ou pas loin pour découvrir Midnight Suns, le nouveau jeu de Firaxis. Vous les connaissez peut-être parce qu'ils ont fait toute la licence Civilization et également la licence XCOM qui a été dirigée par Jake Solomon qui est ici avec moi. Thank you so much for being with us, Jake.
Thank you for coming out.
Well, it's a pleasure, and you've been great to us, showing us everything and giving us an early look at Midnight Suns. You gave us a long presentation, which I will probably talk about in my other video. But I have a couple questions now that I've been able to get my hands on the game.
Of course.
I have first-hand experience. First of all, you told us in your presentation that Marvel approached you to work with you on a tactical game, which was kind of my first thing was how did this happen? And how was the collaboration with them? Was it more you giving out your ideas and then greenlighting them or not? Or were they really feeding you ideas? How did that work?
So yeah, they contacted us because they were fans of XCOM. And they were real fans of XCOM. When I first had a call with them, they immediately had, this is true, they immediately had like high level feedback on soldier classes, on the finale mission in XCOM 2. So I was like, oh, these guys really know XCOM. And no, what they said was they wanted us to make the kind of games that we make, that we want to make. They just wanted us to make them in the Marvel Universe because they knew that we were really big fans of Marvel. And so it took us a while. We had to kind of go away, and they didn't say you should tell this story. They didn't say you should use these characters. They didn't say you should make this kind of game. They were like, what is it you would want to do? And so that's when we went away and we thought, well, if we did make a game in the Marvel Universe, what story would we want to tell? What would the setting for this game be? And that's where we went back to the comics that I grew up loving to read. My favorite comic, which is The Rise of the Midnight Suns. So we came back to them, we said, hey, we really would love to have these characters. We'd love to tell this story. This is the kind of game we want to make. And they were unfailingly enthusiastic. They were like, great, let's find a way to make all that work. So yeah, I mean, they're very much a supportive, they definitely don't dictate you. They're very much a supportive team. They partner with you to say, tell us what you want to do. Let's find a way to make it happen.
Very cool.
Yeah.
And how much crossover is there between the MCU, which is the Marvel that most people know nowadays, and the game in terms of how much baggage do people need to know? Do they need to have seen all the movies and everything?
Every post-credit scene.
Every single one. Yeah.
Well, this is the good thing is that we consider ourselves to be in a completely separate universe than any game, than any movie. We just said, and Marvel was great about this, they were basically saying, look, you can change the backstories of the characters, you can change some of their elements to fit the world that you're putting them in, as long as they stay true to who they are. And so some of our characters have different stories than they do in the movies. They have different stories than they do in the comics. Now it would help, obviously, if you haven't seen Marvel movies, it's a good time. They're great movies. So they're great to watch, and they'll definitely give you some more love for some of the characters in our games. The Avengers for sure. Doctor Strange has had a couple of great movies recently. Wanda. So yeah, there are a lot of characters in our game that are in the movies, and so if you watch the movies, you'll probably start loving the characters as much as anything. But you wouldn't need to see them to have any backstory to our
Okay, so it's a Marvel game, but not an MCU transmedia kind of thing. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay, great. Which I guess also might explain why you were able to create a new character as well. You might not have been able to do that in the MCU.
Absolutely true. Yeah, I think that, and that's another sign of how cool Marvel has been, because the idea from the very beginning was, hey, we want to make a new hero. We want to put the player in the Marvel Universe, and we want to give them their own character so they can live alongside all these heroes that they know. And again, that was something that Marvel, from the very beginning, they were like enthusiastic about. They're like, okay, great. Now it's going to be hard to make a new Marvel hero, just so we all know. And there are all these best practices about like what does it mean to be a Marvel hero. But they were very enthusiastic about the idea.
Going to XCOM and the influence, obviously the baggage that brings to Midnight Suns. There are two really important things from XCOM that are not here.
Yep.
That's the grid for movement and cover.
Yep.
So in terms of level design,
And permadeath, I guess.
and permadeath, yeah,
Nobody's
that's a big
dying.
one.
Nobody's dying in this one. Yeah, yeah.
And so in terms of level design, how did you have to go back to square one and redo your whole level design?
We had to go back to square zero. And this is a result of, so when this project started, I was sure that what we were going to do was make XCOM with superheroes, you know. But yeah, every game is built upon some really fundamental pieces. And so yeah, cover is very fundamental to XCOM. The chance of abilities to fail, like missing a shot, that's fundamental to XCOM. Things like random damage, the fact that soldiers can die, there are all these things that are fundamental to what XCOM is, and that's because the fantasy is these soldiers, which are very fallible human creatures, trapped on a battlefield with a superior enemy. The problem is that the fantasy of Midnight Suns is almost the opposite of that, which is you are almost infallible. You are actually the superior force on the battlefield. Like the villains are actually playing the role of XCOM where they're like, oh my God, like these guys are terrifying. And so because of that, all these things, all these mechanics that we had in XCOM, we realized, nope, that won't work, nope, that won't work, nope, that won't, you can't have low damage attacks from here. None of that stuff makes sense. And then what we realized that we had just torn apart, everything we had spent the last 15 years learning was worth nothing to us. And so we're like, it was exciting, but it was also terrifying because we realized we're gonna have to make entirely new systems. So we designed all new systems from the ground up for this game because the fantasy of XCOM is almost the opposite of what the fantasy of Midnight Suns is. But you still wanna make an addictive, turn-based, tactical game where every turn you've got a puzzle, you've got this challenge, how am I gonna survive, how am I gonna take out the bad guys? You want that exact same feeling. But the fantasy is one of, yeah, but you're going to break the fantasy if I miss a shot as Iron Man, like blast. I mean, it's going to feel terrible. So yeah, it means all new mechanics.
Yeah, if it was very strange for me not looking for cover. And after my fight with Venom, where I kept doing these attacks where I, knock them back and they'd hit each other. Yeah. And then he did it to me. I thought, oh, now I've got to start thinking about lines. Yeah. So instead of thinking about cover, you think about lines and cones and...
That's exactly right. And so, yeah, so the geometry changes into much more of a lines and generally like, it's a bit like pool, right? It's like a bit like simplified pool. But yeah, you basically think of things and we always talk about lines. And in fact, when you go to attack an enemy, we always want you to run there in a straight line. Everybody gets out of your way. So yeah, it's a very good insight. Like the geometry in Midnight Suns is all about basically like straight lines to enemies.
And I suppose being heroes and in not the low soldiers that we were in XCOM also might explain why there are only three. You only control 3 characters in a combat. Yeah. I was surprised at that because I always loved having more and more in my squad in XCOM.
Yeah, and so again, it allows us to. We need a certain. The heroes need to be outnumbered by a certain number of enemies because we want your abilities to be able to take out multiple enemies easily, right? Again, that's part of the fantasy. As you said, that's exactly why. Because we need so many enemies to outnumber the heroes so the fantasy feels like, okay, cool. It's not enough to take out 1 bad guy. Like, how do I take out 2 bad guys? How do I take out 3 bad guys with an ability? And since that's part of it, then it's like, okay, we need a lot of enemies. And then if you have 6 heroes there, it's going to be like, all right, this is too much. Yeah.
And so this game is a hybrid between tactical and turn-based, but also third-person RPG. There's a little bit of CCG. We'll touch back on that. It's a first for you. And how, I think.
Yeah,
and how did that mix develop? How did you choose those genres and balance them?
They came out in the middle of development, really. Because again, we started thinking we were making a game much like we had in the past. We were gonna make an XCOM type game, but I will admit, I've always, even when playing XCOM, I've always pictured myself going down into the base, right, and walking around. This time, it was impossible to not do that because you wanted to see these heroes interact. That's the big fantasies. even if they're doing something trivial, even if they're lounging by the pool, you want to see that. You want to be able to hear them talking to each other. You want to be able to walk up and talk to them. You want to feel, a big fantasy is feeling like, oh yeah, here I am in the middle of the superhero base and I can go walk up and talk to Wolverine if I want. So that was the first step, but then all these RPG elements, once you were able to walk around this space and talk to them, then all of a sudden you said, well, now I want my talking to matter. Now I want it to be, I want to make choices that affect how they feel about me. So all of a sudden it became relationships and RPG systems, and those just sort of grew out of the idea of now you're walking around this space. And so they sort of grew organically out of that. Again, discovering the game you're making when you're making it can be very terrifying. It would be better if from the beginning you're like, I know exactly what we're doing, but that is rarely the case, at least in my experience. And maybe that says something about me as a designer, but yeah, that's basically how it happened, is it happened mid-development.
And for the RPG aspect, or Abbey Life as you called it in your presentation, you said that it was optional, but it has, it unlocks bonuses and combos. So how optional is it, and how big a part of the game is it for someone like me, for example, who loves XCOM? Not so much RPGs. How good a time am I going to have with that part of the game?
Well, that's a very good question, and that's something that we've probably been balancing the most over the last year. Is we had all these systems and we put really powerful rewards onto these systems. So it's like, oh, if you develop your A squad of heroes and your B squad of heroes, maybe you have 6 heroes in addition to the hunter that you use all of it. These are my go-tos, right? I've upgraded all of their abilities. I've done everything that I can do for these heroes. Then you start getting into the friendship and you're like, well, you unlock a passive ability, which is very powerful, and then you unlock upgraded versions of that, combos with that hero. So the gameplay rewards became so powerful that we're like, oh, okay, now we have to be careful how much a player has to do to unlock those rewards. And so we actually toned back how many hangouts you had to do, and we started to say, well, if you take heroes in combat, you earn friendship, because we didn't want to have it to be, all right, well, there's something completely divorced from combat that also gives you this huge reward in combat. And so we've tried to strike this balance of it's not like every night you got to go back and have a hangout with the heroes. Instead, it's like every 3 nights or so. There are other ways to gain friendship, so you can spar with them to gain friendship. And so, we've tried to kind of thread that line. But you're right. Is developing friendships optional? No, because the rewards are really strong. But there's so much optional content. You certainly don't have to join all there are clubs around the Abbey. There's a book club, for goodness sake, you could join. There's exploration, you could do the Abbey grounds. There's all that stuff that won't have a significant impact on combat if players are like, nah, I'm focused on making the best fighting force I can.
Okay. And so we've touched on tactical RPG. Now for the CCG part of it, which you had some backlash on. And can I've started on it, and it's card-based, but it's not a CCG.
No.
So can you tell us more about how it works with the abilities and why you chose it for the abilities and kind of why you stuck to it even though there was backlash?
Just the word cards. I mean, the word cards. And I don't blame anybody for thinking that. The word cards can mean so many different things, and people's minds go to so many different places. And really, what it is that every tactical game needs randomness, right? Every tactical game needs randomness to make an interesting, almost unsolvable puzzle, right? If it doesn't have randomness, then the puzzle is solvable. And so tactical games need to be endlessly unsolvable, where you're like, okay, I can figure out this, but the next time I go into a match, or frankly, the next turn, all of a sudden there's a whole new puzzle for me to solve. So if you look at a game like XCOM, the randomness was in, okay, you do a random amount of damage. You have a random chance for your abilities to succeed. There's a lot of randomness in terms of you know what you can do every turn, but you don't know if they're going to work. You don't know what results you're going to achieve with those abilities. And so basically, just like we had to turn the fantasy on its head, we basically turned the mechanics on their head, and we said, okay, you don't know what you're going to be able to do every turn in Midnight Suns, but everything you can do, every ability does exactly what it says. There is no chance of failure. It's always going to do the damage it says. It's always going to do all the effects it says. And so we've basically taken the mechanics, flipped them on their head to where cards are just a way for us to give randomness to the player every turn. And so yeah, I mean, I think when people hear cards, they think about card battlers or CCGs and all these things where it's like, well, that's not what Midnight Suns is still just a turn-based tactics game, and cards are kind of like how we give you this puzzle of like, well, we're going to take your abilities and we're going to give you a few of them every turn, and we can do that through cards because when we do that, people are like, oh, I get it, it's cards. Now, if I said we're not going to use cards, but I'm still going to do that where it's like your heroes all have abilities, but I'm going to give some of them to you every turn, you'd be like, what the hell is going on? What am I doing here? So cards are like, yeah, it's a tool. It's a visual tool where people go like, oh, I get how that works now.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, you've kind of answered most of my other questions because I was talking about the randomness and how cards replace the percentages like in XCOM. So lastly, how long is the game? Do you expect the campaign and the side quests? How long can we expect it to be?
Long, very long, actually. I think we're saying 60 hours, and I think that's a very, very reasonable estimate. You're not going to be a completionist at 60 hours. 60 hours would be like, I'm going to play the game, I'm going to experience some of the optional content, but I'm going to push the story forward. I think 60 hours is a very reasonable estimate for how long it would take people.
For nowadays, I think that's actually a good length. I'm sick of those games that take 200 hours. So 60 or like 80, that's
yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's a long game, but you're right. I mean, you could probably get that somehow. I mean, the other thing is you really want to, I view the game as like more about replayability too, because it does have length, but the fact that the roster is so big
and you don't get to use them in every playthrough.
Right. So you won't be able to, you really focus on like 6 of the 13 heroes and you're like, well, these are the ones I played with the most. I didn't even unlock all the abilities of this other, 6 heroes. So yeah, it's very replayable from that standpoint where I've played it many times and I feel like I've played less with this hero than these other heroes. And so, yeah, it's a very replayable game as well.
All right, very cool. Any last words of wisdom that we should know before we...
Words of wisdom? No, I think what I'm really excited for, which I think you're a part of too, is making sure that people understand the important things, they understand what this game is, because I get it, right? I think we're doing something that's very different, and there's always... I don't blame people for saying, I don't understand what that means compared to past games you've made, or you're using the word cards, what does that mean? And so if people can just see the game and understand it, ideally everybody in the world could just play this game, and then I'd be like, all right, great, let's just let everybody play it.
Well, I mean, a lot of Marvel fans who don't know tactical RPGs, a little bit more hardcore like XCOM, this might be their gateway.
That's the hope, I suppose, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time, and I hope that this preview event and showing people gameplay from people outside the studio is going to be a first look into understanding the game.
Yep.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.